Welcome back to the Budget Gamer channel, where we bring you critical and in-depth reviews of just about every indie game we can get our hands on, and today we're going to be taking a look at Ploid for the Nintendo Switch. And no, this is not Ploid Saga, this is just Ploid. Saga has a compilation of a shoot-'em-up and an adventure game and a platformer, but Ploid, just Ploid, is a different platformer wrapped up in the same Ploid universe. So now that we got that straight, moving on. As part of the same Ploid universe as Ploid Saga, we have a very similar backstory. The Ploids themselves are engineered beings with the ability to manipulate their DNA to be able to perform certain tasks. And as such, in Ploid, our main objective is to find 7 hidden cartridges of information that'll allow us to unlock the secret of X evolution, which will basically allow you to turn into super beings and do whatever, yada yada, save the universe. But none of that actually happens in the game, so moving on. Each of these 7 cartridges will be placed at the end of one of 7 different platforming levels. And as the eShop description dictates, this will be a retro-inspired technical platforming game. And as there are no checkpoints anywhere in any of the levels, it is thankful that they are fairly short. As a classic-inspired technical platformer, we can expect a low pixel count and some somewhat monochromatic graphics, as well as some slightly spastic jumping controls through environmental hazards. Now there are a few enemies, like 2 or 3, spaced through the duration of each of the game's levels, so just like everyone's favorite jump and shoot man, we can jump and shoot. And as the combat mechanics in Ploid actually allow us to not only shoot off screen, but do damage off screen, we can also follow the old spray and pray rules of when in doubt, shoot it out! Because there are the occasional situations where moving from screen to screen, like Jump and Shoot Man, that an enemy might be laying in wait right off screen to take away one of your few life points. Thankfully though, as I mentioned earlier, enemies are actually fairly few and far between in each of the game's levels, so with only a few health points and no way to regain health, unless you're hit by the same enemy multiple times, you're probably not in danger of dying. This is fundamentally not true for environmental hazards though, as those work on more of a one-touch death mechanic. And so whether it's spikes from the floor or spikes from the ceiling, the real imposition of the technical nature of the game becomes balancing your own reaction time with finessing that jump button just perfectly enough to be able to navigate over, around, or even between sets of spikes. And with 7 levels having completely different themes, you can expect ice and water levels to pretty much fundamentally rebalance the hazard zones, giving you a brand new learning curve, and just adding that much more to the challenge of the game. Visually, as stated before, Ploid is a retro-inspired platformer, and therefore we do get our low pixel counts and our monochromatic themes, and so at least visually the game is exactly what you would expect. Right off the start menu, we also get access to the game's soundtrack with a few different selectable tracks, though taking a minute to listen to each, you realize they're not terribly long. And this is probably because, as I mentioned before, for the most part of the game, each of the levels themselves are fairly short. And so while the initial learning curve on every one of the level areas may have you listening to the same track on repeat, at least the chiptune music is decent enough to not really get frustrated with the repetition. Moving on though, Ploid does have some things that you might want to be aware of before you decide to invest your time or your money. But as it's not a terribly expensive indie game, some of these are more or less forgivable depending on what type of gamer you are. First and foremost though is probably the game's length, which is, no fault of its own, that's kind of a thing with indie games. But even though the levels are short and do have a learning curve that does potentially draw out the difficulty of the game and give you some added playtime, overall the entire game still feels really short. And in my own personal experience, every time I got to the end of the level, and I mean every time I got to the end of the level, I was actually a little bit surprised. It was difficult and it was challenging, and while it was actually fair and balanced, even with a complete lack of checkpoints, I always felt like I didn't do enough to get to the end. And that's possibly a fault of the game's second critique, which is a bit of lack of flavor in level design. While there are certain levels with a secondary path, or at least some small deviations to go and collect some dots to get some points, even in the small micro levels in Ploid, there's a fair bit of repetition from room to room. And so in that sense, even while there are 7 completely different gaming environments to play through, they don't really feel all that different. Or at least while they feel different from each other, while you're in a level, each of the rooms doesn't feel that different. And so while it may be a bit nitpicky, if you're navigating through the same room over and over, it's kind of hard to feel like you've actually made any progress. And on the note of progress, that brings us to the next critique of the game. It's almost impossible to know if you've made any, and if you have made some, depending on which buttons you push, you might not be able to keep it. Ploid doesn't have an overworld map. There's no checkpoints that kind of alert you to how many of the discs you've achieved. And after you beat a level, you're warped immediately to the beginning of the next level. There's very little sense of accomplishment, and there's no kind of scale or meter to let you know how close to the end of the game you are. And with no level end boss fights, there really is a very big lack of achievement. But probably the biggest kicker is if you want to start over, you start over. And if you exit the game, there is no warning that that will delete all of your progress. So even if you want to play in EX mode versus story mode, to make that transition will wipe all of the progress from the game. And while that is a pretty large critique, there's still one more thing that just kind of made me wonder why. If you collect like 100 little dots as you play through Ploid, you get an extra life, which is awesome. And you have a health bar with 5 little dots on it, so you can hit an enemy 5 times before you die. But the absolute weirdest thing is it seems like you never get to use any of those extra lives that you have. If you touch a spike, you die and start the level over, and your little point counter is still high, and it still adds to the running total of your extra lives. But as you will apparently have very little opportunity to actually use any of those extra lives you've collected, I actually started using my extra lives as kind of a running tally of how poorly I was doing in the game. If I had replayed a level so many times that I had racked up a lot of extra lives, I felt like I was doing pretty bad. But if I ended with the same number of lives I started with, then I kind of felt like a little bit of a champ. But overall, it really just raised the question of why have extra lives? Why have a health bar if you don't have any enemies? And why have a combat system if there's nothing to fight? But anyway, ending the rant, taking a step back and looking at Ploid as a whole, I'd have to say it's decent as an incredibly short micro-platformer, but with a lack of level diversity, with no story to intrinsically tie the player to any sort of investment in the game, and with kind of the WTF moments on the health bars and point systems in the first place. If you are interested in it, if you do think you'll enjoy it, you just might for a platformer, but probably not for any other reasons other than the raw platforming. And in that sense, if you are actually after a hardcore platformer on the cheap, maybe just pick up Awesome P or Awesome P2. There's a lot going on in those games. They're brutal, but it's a lot of game to be played with a whole lot of these mechanics that games like Ploid might be lacking. But anyway, that does about wrap up the review of Ploid now on the Nintendo Switch, so if you enjoyed the review, or especially if you found it helpful, feel free to throw us a like or a comment to show your support, and don't forget to click that little bell icon when you subscribe to stay updated with the latest content. Because there are thousands of indie games out there, and new and unique ones are coming out every single day. So whether it's an easy hard pass or an absolutely unforgettable gem, chances are if it's on the Switch, you're gonna find out about it right here. But anyway, this has been The Budget Gamer, so as always, thanks for watching.